Well, welcome everybody. My name is Penelope Moon. It's my great pleasure to direct the Center for Teaching and Learning on the Seattle campus of the University of Washington. I'm also affiliated associate professor of history, and I co-lead the Teaching at UW Network, which is a tri-campus collaboration that's focused on providing instructors across our three campuses with the best instructional support we can offer. Teaching at UW is sponsoring today's session. So whether you're coming to us from the Bothell campus or the Tacoma campus or the Seattle campus, we're super glad you're here. Today's session is the fourth in a series of events that we're hosting this year to help broaden and deepen understanding of the new core elements of effective teaching, which the UW faculty adopted into the faculty code in spring 2025. And I'm actually going to share my screen of the Teaching at UW Core Elements webpage. Let me do that right now. And this web page has all 5 core elements. These core elements, you can also find them in the faculty code, and we link to the faculty code, but anyone who has visited the faculty code knows that the formatting is challenging. So we've made it a little more user-friendly and put them here on this web page. These elements are backed, all 5 of them are backed by decades of research and are already practiced by scores of UW faculty members. They are not a comprehensive list of all effective teaching practices, but they are core to any effective teaching practice, regardless of your discipline, your teaching context, or your campus. And today's session is going to focus on this one right here. Let me highlight it. Growth-oriented teaching. And this core element reads, effective teaching creates opportunities for learners to learn through practice and provides feedback that helps them grow their knowledge and abilities. And I will actually put that in chat really quick. Growth-oriented teaching helps students adopt a growth mindset, which prepares them for the struggle that's a necessary part of learning. Students with a growth mindset recognize that their abilities are not predetermined or fixed, but can be actually developed over time. And a teaching approach that offers students opportunities to practice and provides students with meaningful feedback helps students see mistakes as opportunities to grow and helps foster resilience. And that's what our panelists are going to talk about today. Let me stop sharing. I'm so excited to introduce our 2 panelists today. Andrea Anthony is assistant teaching professor in the School of Business on the Bothell campus. And Sarah Chavez is associate dean of faculty in equity and inclusion and associate teaching professor in the School of Interdisciplinary Arts and Sciences on the Tacoma campus. And we've decided on a couple of questions to kind of structure our panel discussion. And I will ask the questions. We'll give our panelists each an opportunity to respond. And after that, we'll move into the Q&A portion. Again, you can ask a question anytime. You can post that question in the Q&A space. And our wonderful program administrator, Nathan, will share instructions on how to get there. Okay. All right, panelists, are you ready? Okay. Ready or not? All right, so the first question we have is, can you talk about how you create or foster growth-oriented classes? And I think we'll start with Andrea.
Sure. Yeah. So they asked me in advance to prepare just a few slides, so I promise this will be short, but it helps sort of frame our discussion here, and I think it gives you guys something to look at while I'm talking through these. So let me just make sure I have it on. There we go. Okay. So for me, I thought I would start with just let's revisit again, and Penelope did a great job summarizing. But what are we trying to do with a growth mindset? And then I'll give you my example since I was nominated to go first. And I think Sarah and I have good complementary things that we're not talking about the same stuff. So I'll kind of be the intro woman today. So again, teaching a growth mindset is trying to show that abilities can be developed, and that sometimes takes a minute for students. They often are thinking, well, I either know it or I don't know it, right? And my abilities are fixed. But instead, we want to try to, you know, help them understand that the strategy that they use to learn, the effort that they use to learn, the dedication that they use to learn can actually change, right? And that can help your abilities. So some of the strategies you would use when trying to use a growth mindset would be instead of talking about did you get the right answer, it's more about praising the process and discussing the process to how we got that answer. That sometimes takes a little bit of practice as a professor. We usually like to just kind of be like, here's how you do it, and here's the right answer. But it's showing and demonstrating the process more and the strategies around getting that process, I think is one of the pieces that I try to practice myself. And the other big one that Penn mentioned earlier is reframing failures as opportunities for learning. That mistakes are good, mistakes help us. I think that's another thing that I really emphasize in the classroom. So one of the, the kind of the three pieces here then, if I'm thinking about how am I going to implement this in the classroom, is I need to find ways to normalize mistakes. I need to demonstrate and explain and reiterate numerous times that those mistakes help us understand what we may, what maybe we didn't understand before and how we can do something differently the next time, right? And I always kind of emphasize like the reward of like, let's make the mistakes now in the classroom so that you're not frustrated at home when you're doing your homework and you can't get that number to come out of your calculator, right? It's a lot more frustrating then when you got your homework's due in an hour versus when we're all together and we're working with our table in the classroom. So let's do those mistakes now. This is the right time. So trying to normalize those and then reframing challenges. So, I have young children and they talk about brain muscles a lot and when with little kids, but I feel like even in the university level, kind of how do we strengthen the way we go up to a challenge, right? How do we practice and attempt and rather than avoid challenges? So I think a lot of times, especially undergraduates, they get nervous and they want to try to avoid and maybe not engage. So trying to reframe that this challenge is a good thing. This is going to help us. We're going to be a lot more successful if we can, take this on. And the other piece that we could be doing in our classroom to help with this is praising the process. So really getting away from like, oh, you did it right, or you're really smart, into highlighting the focus or the persistence or the specific strategy. Like, wow, I really like the way you attempted that. And so I think those are the pieces that we can try to, use in our classroom. So more specifically, the question was, how do I approach this? So I teach finance, which has a lot of math in it. And for me, if you try to watch somebody do math, right? If you're just watching some PowerPoint slides and you're like, yeah, that looks good. Yeah, I do that. Yeah, I would use that formula. And then you get home and like nothing comes out of the calculator the way you think it's supposed to. It's really hard to learn math in that way for most people. And so instead of lecturing with a PowerPoint slide, I use what's called a course packet. And many of you have probably seen course packets, but mine is very much as simple as kind of thinking of like a fill in the blank worksheet. I will set up a problem, I will do it with them. So they have to fill in the course packet while I'm filling in the course packet. And they have to have their calculators out while I have my calculators out. They're not watching me do the problem, they're doing it with me. And then we take a second and they work with their neighbor, and there's a new problem in the course packet where they attempt it on their own. And I just walk around and I help, but I don't lecture to it. And then we review and we go over sort of what happened, what formula did we use? Do we think that worked well? Do we want to go back and change it? And then I go back to my own and I'm going to tell again and I'm going to explain a new concept and we're going to do it together. And then again, they go on and do it on their own. And then after about 20, 30 minutes, then the course packet sort of breaks and it says, okay, now I'm just going to kind of give you a whole bunch of different questions. And we're going to have about a half an hour in the classroom where you're challenged to, it's no longer like I did it, you did it, I did it, you did it. Now it's kind of a mess and we got to figure out where are you going to go and how are you going to solve this. And again, that's a good way for them to practice those methods of like, how did I identify the formula? How did I go about, where they really practice the process of learning rather than just she said this, so I did this. And so I think using the course packet with something with math especially has been really successful with the students. It builds their confidence up. They know that they're going to have to do it on their own right away with their calculators. So they're very invested in the class. Like they are, as soon as I'm demonstrating one, they're writing everything down. Like they're not watching. Like they know they're going to have to do it on their own in about 3 minutes. So it's really nice to kind of keep them, I think it keeps them engaged more just by they know they have this flow to go. And so I kind of structure the course packet with the tell, show, do, review flow that is one of the kind of classic learning methods. So you explain the topic, you explain why it's important, why do we need to know this, why is it cool? We show them, obviously, we need to show them, but then I want them doing it in that safe space, right? In the classroom, and then reviewing it. So that's the main method I find that really sets that growth mindset in my classroom is by having us work through the course packet rather than me just lecturing through the material. So, uh, kind of some of the things when I emphasize it, I really talk about the mistakes a lot, but I say it with pride. Like, here's where I often make a mistake. This is a common one. This is the one I see a lot. How would we, deal with that? So really emphasizing the mistakes and really praising the effort. I always kind of say math should feel a little bit like stumbling around in the dark when you first learn it. It's not supposed to just be crystal clear, and we have to maybe we use a formula and it doesn't work, or maybe we put the wrong input in that formula and we stumble a little bit. And then, but by stumbling, we now remember, oh yeah, I don't put that number there. I want to use this other one, right? So kind of praising that feeling of being a little uncomfortable and that that's a normal place and that's how we want to, be thinking about learning. So again, this growth mindset, I think the hard part as a professor is really emphasizing that our abilities grow with effort and practice, right? And so how do you do that exactly? It's tricky, right? It's not like you just say it and they believe you. I think demonstrating it and showing that you're going to practice it with them and show them the methods, I think is useful. One of the other ways I find that the growth mindset is easier in my classroom is by modeling that effort myself. I'll talk about, hey, I struggled with this. I was a finance student as an undergrad, just like you, and this really was rough. And here's some of my stories about that. And I would explain, like, I had to practice a lot on this particular chapter. Like, I didn't do very well that first time, and I have gotten a lot better, whatever it might be. But sharing your own struggles and your own practice and your own methods when you were learning that, I think the students kind of appreciate that and they say, oh, okay, well, if she also struggled, right? Then that's the process that is typical. And then I think assessment is the other big one. So, how we assess projects or papers or other things can really drive an opportunity for growth and reflection. So, I have a big report that's over, they track a stock and they create a portfolio for the whole quarter. But what do they have to do is they have three different parts to that project. So, they turn in the first part, it's actually due like I think in a week, like very soon in the quarter. And that's they're not doing a whole lot of finance yet with that first part of the project, but it's more like how are we going to set up a report? How are we going to work with our team? How are we going to have a professional formatting? And then I can give them feedback, right? Okay, here's how we want to show graphs. Here's how we want to communicate information. And then with the second round of the paper, they start adding the finance, but then they've also had an opportunity to hear reflection and think about how could we do this better? How could I work with my team better? How could I find those? So having projects where they're staying on that same project and they have opportunities to assess and then resubmit or add to, I think also adds to that growth mindset where they really look at like, wow, I remember that first paper I turned in at the beginning of the quarter, and then the final paper I turned in, night and day, right? But often we just kind of have individual projects throughout the quarter and then they don't see that and they can't reflect on that growth. So I think those are two of the other big ways that I try to use to set that in my class. So I will turn my time back over to Penn, but thank you guys. Hopefully that gives you some ideas to think about.
Yeah, I just want to highlight one thing that I think is so important. In threaded throughout a lot of your strategies is the idea of normalizing mistake making and struggle. And I think so many of our students, like I can't tell you how many students came to me and like, I don't know anything about history. And like, yeah, that's why you're here. Um, and we have so many students that associate struggle with dysfunction, and not to use a dirty word, but that's why they offload to AI, right? Because they
Yeah,
think that this is wrong. Like I have to get this right out of the box. So I love what you're doing. That's awesome.
thank you.
Sarah, what about you?
Um, Thank you, Andrea, for that really cool talk. And you're right, I'm so glad that it's sort of structured the way it is. I also have some slides I'd like to share. I don't know why I'm not seeing oh, there it is. Um, So I have taken a slightly different tactic, which is to sort of talk about setting the environment for these kinds of for these kinds of growth-oriented teaching. Because as Andrea pointed out, saying it is one thing, but providing a comfortable or safe for discomfort space to be able to have them not only hear you say the things, but to feel that there is truth in that process. And so I called mine responsive pedagogy, learning the individual to grow in community, because so much of what my pedagogy is sort of fundamentally, and then also how growth oriented teaching fits in, it has to do with the responsiveness to the folks in the room. And I, as a writing cultural critic, I always love a good quote. So this is from Bell Hooks. She's sort of like, one of the grandmothers of pedagogical theory, but she says community is formed not by the eradication of difference, but by its affirmation, by each of us claiming the identities and cultural legacies that shape who we are and how we live in the world. And that for me is a really important foundation because not only are students having their own sort of internal stressors, but they are also sometimes comparing themselves to other students in the room. Oh, that person's already farther along, or that person knows more than I do. Um, and so I'm going to share a little bit about myself, and this is going to make sense in a minute. So, a little bit about me, where I come from. I come from the California Central Valley. I'm actually in California right now doing some family care, so I'm excited to like step out of that for a second to like have this conversation with you all. But I come from a mestizo family, so we're Mexican and Anglo, working class, mixed education. So some folks in my family have no college education at all, and a couple folks have a BA. And also, I come from a mixed citizenship family. I've done my schooling sort of across the US. My research is focused in critical understanding and creative response to performance of intersectional identity, so specifically in regard to race, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, and socioeconomics. And then I've done a number of trainings in which I have had the opportunity to work with folks who are doing pedagogical work, particularly around some of these more progressive concepts like the growth oriented teaching and bringing a whole self into the classroom. And so the reason I share that is to model sort of what happens at the beginning of my classes. So when we share those personal pieces from our own lives, and I'll share that when I went to college, it was basically like that person's an expert. They're at the front of the room. You're supposed to do what they say, and hopefully things work out. That is not necessarily a pedagogical model that is most effective for our students and not necessarily for the urban serving demographic at not just UW-T, but for all the students across the tri-campus, right? We're in a very different space in terms of how students are coming to our classrooms, particularly after COVID and a number of other sort of just like social things. So by sharing a little bit about yourself, you model vulnerability and openness. Also model self-reflection and self-understanding within the classroom and higher ed, and also complicates stereotypical understanding of instructors. They don't expect that their instructor comes from a mixed citizenship family. They don't necessarily expect that the instructor has a particular ethnic, racial, socioeconomic background. They might make assumptions, that place themselves very far from who we are and where we are. And this might close that gap a little bit so that there's a little bit sort of like small inherent trust is being built. And it models that no one enters a classroom a blank slate. I'm not a blank slate. They aren't blank slates. They came in with learning. That much of which will aid them in what we're going to do in the classroom together, but then also, might conflict or be in conversation with what we do. So this is actually, aside from saying things in class, I also have this as one of my opening pages. when they first, and they get this before they meet me. When I open my Canvas page, this is how they come in, except in the view as student. But they get a little bit about who I am and how I like to be called, especially with the last name Chavez. Some of them want to know, like, how do I pronounce that? How do I refer to you? I also teach writing. And so there are like stereotypes about what are writers like, what do they want? And they're making those stereotypes about every discipline, right? This is what a history person is like, this is what a math person is like. And we're all very complex. So all the ways that we can complicate ourselves for them is really helpful. Also, I share like in this one a picture of my grandmother and me during COVID. I also share a little bit about my background, and then that leads into sort of course orientation. So I'm actually integrating this. I'm a whole person with, and here are the processes in our class. There's no real separation. From, the self from the work that we're doing. And so another quote, just another, this, I know the first time I encountered the idea of using personal information as a way to connect and as a way to set the foundations for a safe space to have difficult conversations. I kind of bristled against that, especially as someone who experienced a lot of discrimination in higher ed. Um, the structure wasn't necessarily built for everybody that's in the room. And so, this quote from Parker Palmer, if we want to grow as teachers, we must do something alien to academic culture. We must talk to each other about our inner lives, risky stuff in a profession that fears the personal and seeks safety in the technical, the distance, the abstract. So, with so many different disciplines and so many ways in which we bring in our own cultural contexts. I think this is a nice reminder for me, at least, that this is difficult work and that vulnerable work that we do for ourselves is helping show our students um, how we can be in the classroom. So, really highlighting what Andrea said about modeling some of these behaviors. And I won't go over this. This was a lot of that intro, but I did want to highlight a couple things that are slightly different from the previous slides was the embracing challenge and discomfort. Like not even just expecting, like not even saying it's okay, but like, no, if I'm not a little bit uncomfortable, I'm maybe not learning. If I'm too comfortable, and everybody wants comfort, right? Like, people wear their pajamas to like to the grocery store. We all want comfort on some level. But really, it's actually like embracing that discomfort and moving through to find the next discomfort that's really showing our learning. And when we are providing a space where students are embracing that discomfort together, and there's the recognition that everyone's experiencing some level, that helps that growth mindset feel like a shared experience and not like an individual endeavor. Um, and that constructive feedback is actually essential for growth and skill acquisition. I don't know, I take yoga and I'm that person who's always like, please come adjust me. Other people are like, oh, don't adjust me. I want to think that I'm doing it right. And I'm like, oh, I'm sure I'm doing something weird. Like I can't see myself. And so like even bringing in that kind of attitude, like you should embrace and maybe even like ask for some of that feedback because that's how we're helping each other grow. Um, there are four things. I'm not going to go through all of them, but these are four very specific assignments that I use to build the environment for growth-oriented teaching. So one is a self-character sketch that the students complete in the first week. We also, throughout the quarter, do weekly check-ins. It takes 5 minutes or less, and like for me, a 2-hour class period. Um, they are very low stakes community building topics. I have a couple examples that I'll share. We also do community goal setting. So again, that the classroom, yes, we have our own personal goals, but actually so many of our goals intersect both amongst students and amongst what the institution is hoping the class will provide for students. And so if we can recognize that shared journey and similar shared spaces that we want to end in, that also helps the space feel safe for that growth-oriented building. And then process-oriented assignments, very much like what Andrea was talking about, but mine look different just because it's a writing class. So in terms of the self-character sketch, um, this is what it looks like. I'm not going to go over this huge preamble. That's like a little mini lecture talking about essentially that we are characters. And when we think about, like, right, we're the main characters in our lives. And when we're maybe reading a book or writing a story, we might think about, like, what are the details of that character? Because that's going to dictate how they act in a certain space. Well, it's actually the same for us. And understanding our own characteristics and our own socioeconomic background, our sociopolitical positioning within the culture, that helps us understand how we're engaging in a space. And so students are invited to fill out this. Nobody sees it but me. So, sensitive information like age and weight for some people is really like cringy, but it's really just a way for students to really kind of understand both the facts of their body and the facts of their lives. And how they bring that in. So some of the stuff we control, a lot of it we don't control. And it's important to recognize that a lot of what we do is influenced by things that we didn't necessarily choose. And so recognizing that we're all in that space together. And so at the end of this, we actually have little writing prompts, and that's the part we share as a group where folks are invited to sort of say, here's one way that my identities affect how I'm engaging in something. And then someone else in class gets to say, oh, that's very similar to how I do. Like, that's an exciting thing that we share. And other people are like, wow, that's totally different. I want to think about that, or I hadn't thought about that. So being able to provide them foundations for shared like life experiences. And then the sample weekly check-in. These are just three examples. They especially like the what has been your preferred method of escape this week. Because again, we spent very little time on this. This is about community building. This is about a space where we share low stakes things so that when we get to higher feeling, high stakes tasks where we know that we might experience failure, or I like, experience like not maybe getting to the place we meant to be or where we wanted to be. It's like I say, I already know this person. This person also likes the show Castlevania and they're not going to judge me. Or this person also, they mentioned like a cooking video that I want to watch, right? So now there's this like we're in this journey together. We have these little pieces of essentially like shallow familiarity that actually paves the way for that deeper engagement and that sense of safety in the classroom. And I always start, like I always participate. I never ask them to do something that I'm not also willing to share. And my favorite question is, what is at least one thing you've done in the last 48 hours to support your academic engagement and capacity for learning? And when I talk about this with them, I'm like, did you eat breakfast? That is something that helps like set that groundwork. Did you get any sleep? Did you remember your books? Right? And so then they start to be like, oh, okay, these small things are all feeding into my education and my ability to show up in the room and to show up for myself. Because that's, if we're not showing up for ourselves, we're not showing up for anyone else either. And that is also part of the growth mindset. I want to move on. I know I've been talking for a bit, but I'm just gonna like very quickly just mention that we also do community goal setting. Happy to share these later or this slide deck. But this is about kind of putting into conversation individual goals with community goals so that folks can see that this journey that they're stumbling along together is together and that they're all going to stumble, but they all want to kind of help uphold each other in the same, going in, a similar direction. And then in terms of the low stakes process oriented assignment for my classes, it might be something like a 5 to 8 page paper. And it's broken down into multiple pieces, and those pieces are getting small points that lead to larger points, and it's also getting both peer feedback in some sections and then instructor feedback in other sections, and both peer and instructor. And that's really helpful for the students too, because when they're thinking about the growth-oriented mindset and these potential stumblings as places of growth and those discomforts or disappointments as places to move farther in the direction that they would like to go in, it's even helpful to see like now they literally, by reading each other's peer drafts, saw how somebody else maybe stumbled and they can catch it in themselves, or they're able to, share with that person what they saw, and then that person feels comfortable sharing with them. It also gives them room to ask me questions and to disagree with me because maybe I've recommended something that their peers didn't. And then that's a really fruitful place for us to talk about like goals and constructive feedback and how that works together. And that despite being at the front of the room and despite being, like your instructor is an expert in their field, that doesn't mean they're infallible. That does not mean that they're not also on their own growth-oriented journey in terms of teaching and, moving forward in their own research and expertise. So another way that we're able to kind of like really set the environment and foundation for embracing that discomfort and moving forward feeling held and supported.
Thank you, Sarah. That was so rich. A couple of things come to mind. First of all, scaffolding, yes, right? Like that's making space for people to grow. And if you think about how we grow physically, right? We just don't wake up one morning and we're 8 inches taller. We grow a little bit at a time. And so scaffolding, that's what scaffolding does. So I love that you talked about that. And I just in general love the attentiveness to creating an environment of care and support because mistake making is inherently risky, right? So creating that environment where people feel that they can take risks is so important. So thank you for sharing about that.
Thank you.
So our next question, when we were when the faculty senate members, the Future of Teaching and Learning initiative that kind of produced a draft of the core elements, when they were in draft stage, the faculty senate was involved. There was a working group. We met with lots of different faculty across all 3 campuses and lots of different departments. And one question that frequently came up, one point of anxiety is, how am I going to demonstrate any of this stuff in a teaching evaluation or a promotion and tenure process? And so that's our second question. How have you demonstrated growth-oriented teaching, or how do you plan to demonstrate your growth-oriented teaching in an annual evaluation or a promotion and tenure scenario? Some of your slides maybe point to your answers, and we're going to start with Sarah.
Yeah, thank you. So I have thought about this a lot because I did go through the promotion process relatively recently. And I will share, I have 2 slides. And this first one is this is a quote that I pulled from my narrative, my promotion narrative from assistant to associate teaching professor. And I specifically pulled this one too because it's talking about that self-character sketch that I shared with you all. And essentially, so much of what we're doing when we're being evaluated by, our colleagues, they don't necessarily do the same work that we do. And they don't necessarily, depending on the structure of your department or your school, they don't necessarily understand the field you're in. And so really in plain, non-jargony language, saying, here's a thing that I do, and here's why I do it. And here is how it is being upheld in other places, right? Like, yes, I developed my own curriculum. Yes, this is my assignment. But here are the underpinnings based on research of best practices in pedagogical theory. So here I talk, before this point, I talk about responsive pedagogy, and I explain, right, like to invite students to view and validate their own cultural experiences, but it offers me a window into what they feel are defining aspects of their culture and character. Um, and in responsive pedagogy, they talk about the inside out, like recognizing the human first and then the outcome. And so then I also talk about, I'm forgetting his first name, but this theorist, Hammond, who talks about the on-ramps to learning. And so that way, it's not just, hey, I did a thing, but hey, I did a thing and I did it for this outcome, and the outcome is actually happening, and here are the theoretical and or research underpinnings. So that way they have sort of like a fuller context for that labor, and the why of that labor, because not everyone necessarily has the same background. And so we want to bring in anyone who's reading our materials into that conversation. And then on something maybe a little less high stakes, but still high stakes, like an annual report or an activities report, regardless of whether someone is on the teaching line or the tenure line, we're all thinking about our teaching. And I make sure in like either a narrative for the annual report or in my activities report, I'm highlighting any pedagogical or curricular trainings that I've gone to. And I might add a couple sentences about what I learned and how I'm incorporating that in the classroom. And I would use the words growth oriented, right? I would go back to that faculty code and that language, and you pull that language directly from there and say, my A and B is reaching these specific things that have been asked of us in terms of instruction. And then thinking about how you can incorporate your research with pedagogical training and to be able to say, hey, I'm trying to present some of this, or I'm, going to conferences to learn some of this. Um, and this is my favorite one actually, is pulling quotations from student reflection papers and or student evaluation narrative responses that support successful implementation of growth-oriented practices. My students do a lot of self-reflection. We do a midterm one, and then we do an end of term that are questions that I provide for them that are like more specific to the classroom and to what I've seen experienced and what I've seen them kinds of grappling with. And then, of course, there's the official student evaluation. And I pull from all of those because you're going to get different versions of what they're thinking about at different times in their learning process. And, if it's for them, then we want to listen to them. And this is one way to provide that evidence in our promotion materials.
I love that you kind of flip the script and apply the core element to yourself. And I think that's one of the reasons why the Teaching at UW website actually has one of its core menu tabs is reflect and iterate. Like you're never going to stop learning how to teach. And so the fact that you applied that kind of growth mindset and growth oriented teaching to your own practice, that's awesome. Thank you. I'm tickled, like I'm giddy about this. Uh, Andrea, how would you, or how have you demonstrated growth-oriented teaching in an evaluation process?
Yeah, so my answer to this will be more brief because I knew Sarah had recently gone through the process and I have not gone through the process. And Sarah had great slides to really give you some examples and some ideas. So for me, just to add to her list, which her list is perfect, one of the things we do in the School of Business is we have a workshop for our teaching professors and our tenure track professors that if they want to have a brown bag or a seminar series about something you're doing in the classroom, pedagogy or whatnot, it's your opportunity to share and talk about it. And that can be used not only to talk about it and learn, right, and get some feedback, but it also gives you an opportunity to demonstrate how you've been applying it and it's moving past just your classroom, right? And so finding opportunities for brown bags or workshops like that where you can demonstrate and give examples and talk more about what you're doing, I think is really nice when you're writing those narratives. Also, just like Sarah said, I do a midterm review where I ask much more specific questions than just the standard, university one, and the same with the end. And it's especially around that course packet. I always tell them when they first go to print the course packets, they're always a little bit like, do we really need to do this? Is this really a thing? And then by the end, I ask, what can I be doing differently? What about these course packets? How could I change them? Is there ways that could be more engaging, et cetera? And they're always just like, you can just see they're glowing of like, thank God for the course packet. So you can having that demonstrated via their feedback as well is going to be useful, come time to show like, yes, no, these things are being used and they are, being appreciated and the students are finding success. So I think looking for ways like that as well to ask more questions from your students and as well as to be able to tell other people about it, going to the conferences, trying to incorporate your own research around pedagogy, perhaps if you have a new idea. I think those are all great ideas. So that's all I had to add to Sarah's great deck.
One of the things that I'll add, which you both demonstrated when you were answering the specific questions, is that you walked us through the thinking behind your assignment. And in other sessions that we've hosted on the core elements, that's been kind of a theme, like demonstrate that in your packet, like annotate an assignment and kind of share out your thinking behind your design. So I really appreciate the list of things that you both offered. Thank you so much to both of you. This is a really rich discussion.